This is the Making Waves podcast. My name is Dave Rotman. We're here with Josh Haeder, who is the treasurer of the state of South Dakota, and Jason Williams, who also works in the treasurer's office. Welcome, gentlemen.
It's good to be with you. It's something I've been looking forward to for a long time, so thanks for having us both today. We appreciate it.
Always good to talk to you, Dave.
Oh, thanks for being on. So let's get right into it. Could you explain what the treasurer's office does and what is unclaimed property?
Yeah, so one of our primary responsibilities is to focus on the division of unclaimed property. Is when the state receives unclaimed funds, it's our job to locate rightful owners and try to get their unclaimed funds back to them. For context, people are surprised. One of the questions I usually ask people when we're out in the public is, how much unclaimed property do you think we've received, say, in the last decade? And people will say, well, $70 million, $80 million, something along those lines. They are generally flabbergasted when they hear that we've received in about $1.5 billion over the last decade, and we still have about $1.2 billion that is still claimable by the rightful owners. So when you see us, on TV or doing interviews like this, the whole point of it is to encourage people to check their name and see if they have unclaimed funds. Just a free plug on that, Dave. It's cash.sd.gov. That's where people can go to check and see if they have unclaimed funds. And I would just, one thing I always throw out there for folks is if you're looking up your name, just know that there is never a cost to claim your unclaimed funds. So again, our responsibility is to advertise and search out the folks that have these unclaimed funds.
And last week I put in a claim for some unclaimed funds that I had, just some old bills that I overpaid.
Well, that's awesome. Do you care to tell the listeners, because they can look it up, how much money you had?
Oh, it was something like $30, two different $30 charges. Just old bills that were returned to me from my cell phone.
I'm glad you said that because, when you talk about unclaimed property, people frequently ask, well, where does it typically come from? And it typically comes from, things like that where you've had overpayments on bills. What I frequently tell people is generally unclaimed property comes from like bank accounts, stock bonds, dividends, securities. But we get some fascinating things. The most important thing there is people tend to relocate a fair amount, and if they don't know that they have an account somewhere and they forget to update their address, state law says that after 3 years, which is called dormancy period, if the holder, which generally think of like a bank or a financial institution, can't locate the rightful owner, that's when it becomes unclaimed property and it's turned over to the state and becomes our job to find those folks. One of the cool things, I'm just going to give you this before we get into some of this other discussion, is we get safety deposit boxes once in a while, and that was one thing I was not prepared for is the things that come in safety deposit boxes. And you get, you get cool stuff. You get wills, and we've seen World War II letters, things like that. But we've gotten gold teeth, gold bars, silver bars. So the previous treasurer got a woman's ashes. Things that you don't think about when you're running to do this job. So it's when you think of unclaimed property, it can literally be anything, and it's fairly all encompassing at the end of the day.
Coming from just banks, but also hospitals, department stores. What other organizations would have to give you unclaimed property?
Yeah, so, a big one would be gift cards. People get gift cards for the holidays, birthdays all the time. You think of places like Walmart or any of these other big box stores. The same rules as far as dormancy period of 3 years applies to all of those big box stores. So, people are fairly surprised at the number of gift cards that we get sent to the state, and that's a pretty big one.
And, of course, this is not tax money, so it doesn't belong to the state of South Dakota. It belongs to the people who, of course, own that unclaimed property, citizens.
Right. That's correct, Dave. If you look at unclaimed property laws, they simply state, just to kind of pare it down, that the state, in South Dakota, for example, our job is to only hold these funds until we can find the rightful owners. That's all we're to do with the money. It is not tax revenue. It is not to be spent that way. It's simply to be held until we find the rightful owners at the end of the day. That is correct. Some folks think, well, this has got to be tax revenue. It's not the case in any perspective. It rarely ever comes from taxes in any perspective. Thus, it's not really revenue. And the example I would give you on that, Dave, and we can get into this a little bit, one of the issues that we face since I've taken office is the state of South Dakota, through the legislative process, is able to spend in unclaimed funds whatever we don't return in a given year. Okay, like this year we bring in $310 million. We can return, just rough math, $50 million. The state can spend the rest of that money. However, that is carried as a liability on our books because it is not revenue, even if the state is using it as revenue. So that has been one of those pain point issues for me since I've been elected to this job.
To clarify, we have debt that we owe to the people who have unclaimed property that, of course, the state of South Dakota has spent. But theoretically speaking, that could be claimed at any time.
That's correct. So let me further clarify it for you. So over the last decade, when I say receded in, that just means the money that we've brought in from holders like financial institutions. We've receded in about $1.5 billion. That's with a B. We still have claimable by rightful owners $1.2 billion. Now, get this. So most people will ask me when I tell them that, well, how much interest have we earned on that money over the years? They're flabbergasted when I say zero, because 100% of that $1.2 billion has been spent, and you are correct, it's carried as a perpetual liability to the state of South Dakota, meaning it's still money that's owed to somebody else. It's not money that is counted as revenue at any point in time. So as of today, we have a $1.2 billion liability with no money set aside to pay those claims should they be claimed.
That doesn't seem like the right thing to do. That doesn't seem right.
Well, I hope you didn't fall off your chair, because, again, people are absolutely surprised, when we talk about that liability. And listen, if I were to carry that a major liability in my personal life, or anybody listening to this interview and podcast would do that, that would be what most would consider incredibly poor financial management at the end of the day. And it's the reason, again, since I've taken office, that we've talked about the importance of introducing a trust fund. And again, we could get into that a little bit, but just very briefly, a trust fund where it says at the end of the day, whatever we can't return as a state in unclaimed property in a given year, then goes into a trust fund where it can earn interest. And interest at the end of the day can then be sent back to the general fund and be used as a source of what we call ongoing revenue. But you're protecting those unclaimed property dollars by setting them in the trust. And so, Dave, one of the things we're talking about is this $1.2 billion liability. If over time we're putting these funds into a trust, it becomes a lifelong asset to the state of South Dakota. It's something that doesn't end at any point in time. So it goes past me and the next generation at the end of the day.
And the state of South Dakota has more than one trust fund from various projects that they have done over the years. And so these trust funds, of course, it's just gets the interest. It's invested by the state of South Dakota, and interest can be spent by the state of South Dakota legally, legitimately. But this trust fund would basically be there to cover the costs of claims that are made and for any unfunded liabilities that come up in the future.
That's correct. So I'm going to give you three things. And the first thing, as you said, invested by the state of South Dakota. Point of clarification, invested by the number one investment council in the United States of America, the South Dakota Investment Council. So that really gives me a high level of confidence. Dave, when you look at our trust funds, their average rate of return is about 7%, sometimes a little higher, sometimes a touch lower. But that compounds over time. It pays out 4% a year. So anything over that 4% is reinvested back into the principal. So you look at, if we're putting $180 million in this year and $200 million next year, and it pays out 4%, an additional 3% goes on top of that principal balance. Again, the goal for us, realistically, at the end of the day, is get this thing to $1 billion. It's the largest trust fund in South Dakota history. I just wanted to point that out to you. Now, I'll just give you two things here. So, people might be a little confused. We've got Senate Bill 155 and Senate Joint Resolution 505. So I'll just give you a quick rundown of why we have a bill and why we have a resolution, if you're cool with that.
Absolutely. That's the solution. Go ahead.
Yes. So to give you the solutions, again, this is something that myself and Jason and our entire team has looked at really over the last 6 years. And just to give you some historical context, we brought a bill and a resolution, I think it was 6 years ago, something like that, and it did not pass. Things have changed this year as people see, the spending disparities that we have. So we have Senate Bill 155. What Senate Bill 155 does at the end of the day is it establishes a quote-unquote trust fund, but it's really a savings account at the end of the day. And what it now the reason we did that, and I'll tell you why, where that goes, is there's still large dollar amounts that we plan to see over the next year or two, right? Well, if we don't have a bill, we have no way to bring those funds in over the next year or two. We'd have to wait for a resolution to pass. having a bill allows us to bring money in starting next year. And what we did in that is we recognized that the legislature has an over-reliance on these funds. And so we brought together all the players. We had, of course, Senator Taffy Howard, who is the prime sponsor, Representative Chris Casson. We've got all of the members of Appropriations, the Lieutenant Governor's office came together and said, listen, we want to get this done. This is a priority of the Treasurer's office, but we don't want to necessarily just pull the rug out from the legislature because it's not the new legislature's fault for what we're doing. We just need to try to fix the problem. So what we've done is we've said, instead of pulling that rug out, we're going to have a responsible drawdown over about a decade. So that would start next year if we get this through the House, where it would say the legislature can spend $65 million in ongoing revenue, and it'll decrease by $4 million every year for about a decade till it gets to that $25 million mark. And then once it gets to $25 million, that is the ongoing revenue annually that the legislature can spend and count on from unclaimed property. That's a pretty safe bet that will always bring in significantly more than that. But every year, whatever amount is over the top of that, starting at $65 million and then going down to $25 million, anything over that goes into the trust fund. Having that bill at the end of the day, again, allows us to capture that money starting next year. But there's a caveat with that. I said we're starting a trust fund. When the legislature approves a bill like this, you can only manage the money in what's called the cash flow fund. So essentially what we're doing is setting up a glorified savings account at the end of the day because it can only earn a rate of return of about 5%. Better than nothing. We can start bringing in those large dollar amounts, but at the end of the day, it requires the voters to approve a trust fund for the investment council to have the capacity to utilize all the investment tools of the other trust funds to get that 7-8% return. So that's why we also have a resolution on top of this, SJR 505, to go to the voters during 2026. If they approve, then we have a permanent trust fund where we get that high rate of return. And I would just tell you, Senate Bill 155, based on the work that we've done, has the Senate 35-0. It's a historic piece of legislation. If you listen to President Pro Tem Chris Carr, he said historic legislation. It's one of the most impactful things that the legislature can do. So we're really proud of the relationships that we've created to get both of those bills through the Senate chamber of 35-0.
Mm-hmm. And just for historical perspective here, this is historic for several reasons. One is that previously in the past legislative sessions, a trust fund like this would be opposed by some of the sitting legislators, and that's completely flipped. That's completely changed. Everybody's on board.
That's 100% correct. Matter of fact, if you go back 6 years ago when this was first brought to the legislature, listen to the House floor debate. Boy, I tell you what, they were kicking and screaming and talking about all these one-time projects. And our argument then is the argument that we have today that, yes, one-time projects can be good if they're properly vetted and they go through the legislative process, not forced down anyone's throats. However, when you're borrowing money from unclaimed property to do those projects, that's the wrong thing to do at the end of the day. To give you context on that, this year, people are paying attention to the prison funding bill. You'll notice that they wanted to take, and this bill died today in the House, I believe it's 1025, died 35-35 because they needed a majority. It said that they would take $186 million from unclaimed property and put it into the prison trust. Now, I'm not here to speak on the prison, but what I'm here to say is that's just borrowed money at the end of the day. And so, proud of the legislature that they, took some initiative on that.
Well, that's the right thing to do because literally that's somebody else's property that they're trying to take and use for a project.
100%. And what we've said, what my team is said is that at the end of the day, let's take that money, put it in an account, allow it to earn interest, use the interest at the end of the day, but don't touch the principal because it truly does belong to somebody else. The only time we ever want to touch the principal is if for some scenario not enough unclaimed property comes in at the end of the day to pay claims, that's when it would be used, and that's it at the end of the day. And so that's good fiscal management at the end of the day, and I wish the feds would pay attention to what we're doing here in South Dakota because they could use a dose of good fiscal management. South Dakota has the opportunity to be an example that other states can follow with this trust fund idea. Where we're at in the process today is we'll have 2 bill hearings again for Senate Bill 155 and Joint Resolution 505 on the House side either late this week or early next week. Once we get that to the House floor, then we can have the governor sign the Senate bill. As you know, Dave, joint resolutions don't need a signature of the governor. They pass both chambers and then go to a vote in the public in 2 years. And so we get that passed. I would just encourage everybody, there's going to be a lot of constitutional amendments and things to vote on the ballot in a couple years. Make sure you're paying to the Unclaimed Property Trust Fund. We're going to absolutely need a yes on that from the people of South Dakota.
Action items for our listeners. One is to contact their legislators and support SB 155. Second would be in 2026, vote yes on the Unclaimed Property Trust Fund. And, of course, third, go to the Treasurer's website and claim your property.
Let's tackle yes the first two. Senate Bill 155 again will be in House Appropriations. You're welcome to reach out to those folks. If we're fortunate enough to get it through there, then of course contact your representatives so we can get it to the governor's desk. Yeah, vote yes on the resolution, and then of course we're always plugging this. Go to cash.sd.gov. Check and see if your name's on the list. Again, there is never a cost to claim your unclaimed funds. Look up your family members. Give them a call if you see their name. It's kind of a fun process. Word of mouth is always the strongest and freest source of advertising you can have at the end of the day. So cash.sd.gov. So my esteemed deputy, your next state treasurer, Jason Williams, has a couple comments.
Dave, I was just going to mention that one of the unique things working with Josh in the treasurer's office is he's a very innovative guy, very open to change. And one of the things we've been working on is data matching. So when we get a lot of information in for unclaimed property, such as Social Security numbers, tax ID records, addresses, names associated with these properties, he has started a program for data matching that allows us to go out and find the person who's missing this property rather than waiting for them to come find us. That's another huge reason why we need to have this trust fund set up in law, because it's going to generate larger returns in the future than in previous years, and it's just going to protect the state of South Dakota and taxpayers from having to foot the bill to pay those claims back if we have some additional funds set aside.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Data mining, data matching is something that's done by just about everybody at this point, governments and for corporations. It should be used for good, to find people and give them back their money proactively.
Well, and I just leave it. That's kind of been our motto, both on unclaimed property and the Treasury Services Division. Just because it's always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's the right or most effective way to get the job done moving forward, and that we always have to challenge ourselves and our processes every single day to be better for the taxpayers of South Dakota.
And just to put the trust fund in context, the three other trust funds that we have in South Dakota, the Healthcare Trust Fund, the Education Enhancement Trust Fund, and the Dakota Cement Trust Fund, the principal balance that went in for all of those three when they were originally created totals about $827 million. If we would have started a trust fund 10 years ago and all the funds were coming into South Dakota would have gone into a trust fund, it would have exceeded $1 billion within 10 years. There has been a sizable amount of money that's been coming into the state of South Dakota for the last 3 years. I think we've brought in $600 million in unclaimed properties.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for being on the Making Waves podcast. My name is Dave Rotman. We've been here with Josh Haeder, the Treasurer of South Dakota, and his deputy, Jason Williams. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.